Good morning. We continue our study today on American Presbyterians and Revival. I do have some additional sheets and books here. If anybody needs them, if you just raise your hand, Nick will get them to you. So we come to the time of the American Revolution. The colonial population of America is heavily influenced by Reformed Christianity, and yet things changed. Not only was a new American identity forming, but religious expression itself had also been changing due to the influence of the Great Awakening. Today we're going to hear Dr. Godfrey explore the changing landscape of the New World to show how it had indeed become a new world. So when you're finished with this session, you should be able to define what deism is and what post-millennial eschatology is. You should be able to explain how postmillennialism shaped Puritan concerns and influenced them and the Great Awakening. And you should be able to trace the influence of the Great Awakening on American religion and the influence of the American Revolution on American identity. This morning I'd like to read before we begin 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17. 1 Peter 2, starting in verse 11. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So, how does Peter identify Christians in this passage? Okay, he calls us sojourners and exiles. And when he does this, he's kind of setting Christians as sojourners and exiles apart from this world. And yet he's still calling on them to do what? What else does he tell us to do? Even though they're exiles, even though they're sojourners in this world, what does Peter say that we're supposed to do as Christians? Okay, we're to do good. What specifically as it relates to the government? Submit. To be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, or to submit to them. So this is part of what it is to do good and have honorable conduct. So we're obeying ultimately as servants of God, and also as those who cannot be legitimately charged with any misconduct is the way we are to try and live our lives. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our video this morning with Dr. Godfrey.
Well, at the end of our last time together, I noted that at the time of the American Revolution in 1776, probably 90% of the American colonial population that had any religious commitment were committed to a vision of Protestantism that was basically Calvinistic. That would include the Anglicans. We need to remember that in the 18th century, the Anglicans had 39 articles that were their confession of faith. That was a Calvinistic statement. They had a liturgy written by Thomas Cranmer, who'd been a Calvinist, and it was a basically Calvinist liturgy. And although the Puritans had criticisms of Anglicanism to improve it and make it better, it surely ranks as one of the Reformed communities of faith. And when you add then to the Anglicans and the Dutch Reformed and others with the Puritans, you have 90% of the religious life in America in 1776 dominated by Calvinism. So what happened? How did things change so much from this broad consensus of Calvinism and a broad consensus that the church ought to be established and supported by the state, to quite a new world by the time of the writing of the Constitution and the formation of the American Republic. That's what we want to begin to look at. Part of what changed, as I said last time, was the influence of Enlightenment thought that particularly manifested itself in some of the founding fathers in America, as we call them, of the American Constitution, who had moved away from Christianity to a form of religion called deism. They believed in God. They believed that God had created the world, but they tended to believe that God had then left the world to run itself, and we were significantly on our own as human beings. That God didn't intervene. He didn't intervene miraculously. He didn't intervene by the work of Christ or the Holy Spirit to make us different. They tried to sound as Christian as they could, so they would praise Jesus as a great moral teacher, but they had moved away from classic Christianity, and that Enlightenment emphasis was becoming an increasing influence on thinking in various parts of American life in the 18th century. The church, the Calvinistic churches, particularly the churches in New England, the Puritan churches, were not overly alarmed at this development. It's always interesting what people in any given moment see as the important things going on in their own time. And very often we miss the really important things going on in our time and focus on other things that are not as important. Part of the reason that the Puritans were not greatly alarmed is that they were all committed to an eschatology that we call postmillennial. Postmillennial eschatology says that over time, things will get better and better in the life of the church. That over time, the church will be more and more successful and more influential. And therefore, if we hit bumps in the road, if we have difficult times, we don't need to overly worry about that, because the future belongs to us as Christians, not just in terms of the return of Christ to make all things new, but in history itself. Christ will be building his church in a way that the church will succeed. Wasn't the promise to Abraham that all the nations of the earth would be blessed in him? And that continued to be the expectation. Weren't the apostles sent out to make disciples of all nations? So there was this sense that Christ would be building his church in and through nations, and that the future would be good. This came to classic expression in what is known as the Savoy Declaration of 1658. You all remember it well. This was the Puritan Congregationalist revision of the Westminster Confession of Faith. And in this revision, they changed what the Westminster Confession had said about the church and the future to express more clearly their postmillennial expectations. So this is the Savoy Declaration that many of the Puritans in New England would have embraced. This is what it says. As the Lord is in care and love towards his church, hath in his infinite wise providence exercised it with great variety in all ages, for the good of them that love him and his own glory. So, according to his promise, we expect that in the latter days, Antichrist being destroyed, which meant the Pope, when the Pope is destroyed, when the Jews are called, there was an expectation of a large conversion of Jews in the future. When the adversaries of the kingdom of his dear Son are broken, the churches of Christ, being enlarged and edified through a free and plentiful communication of light and grace, shall enjoy in this world a more quiet, peaceable, and glorious condition than they have enjoyed. So this is their confidence that the future for the church in history will be more glorious than it's been. Things are going to get better. So we may look back at the Puritan times in New England and say, well, look at the internal tensions, look at the difficulties, look at the struggles, look at the changing world that surrounds them. That's not what they were focused on. They were focused on their confidence that they would overcome these problems and the church would become ever more glorious and successful and influential on earth. So that confidence actually will stay with the church right into the 19th century. We'll come back and talk about that later. But this confidence then seemed to be, for many, powerfully reinforced in the middle of the 18th century by the coming of what was known as the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was one of the most profound and influential moments in the history of America. And it largely took place in the 1740s. And the two most famous names associated with the Great Awakening are Jonathan Edwards, who was a pastor and a preacher and a theologian. His preaching was used in the Great Awakening to lead many to a renewed interest in Christ. And he became the great theologian of the Great Awakening, talking about what was happening and how it should be understood. The even greater preacher of the Great Awakening was George Whitefield. George Whitefield, an Englishman and a Calvinist. So here you have this great spiritual awakening taking place. Many people coming to hear preaching, many people feeling they were regenerated by the preaching, many people coming to think more seriously about religious matters, and seemingly the awakening being very much what was expected in terms of a post-millennial view of the future. Yeah, there may be these problems. Yes, the churches seem to be weakening in their influence in a variety of ways. And now comes this great revival. Look at all the people interested in religion. Awakening was a technical Puritan term speaking of people who had been asleep and uninterested in religious matters and now have been awakened to interest in religious matters. It didn't necessarily mean they were regenerated, but it meant that they had interest suddenly in religion where they'd never had it before. And this happened throughout the colonies, in the South as well as in New England. And this shook the whole fabric, intellectually, religiously, culturally, in America. It dominated life in the 1740s for many, many people. And many Puritans, including Jonathan Edwards, thought that this was, if not the beginning of the glory days of the church, at least an anticipation that these glory days were coming. And I think we can say that although the Great Awakening itself only lasted 6 or 7 years, it remained for decades thereafter, certainly well into the 19th century. It remained the model of what people hoped for, what people prayed for, what people expected. The whole idea of longing for revival was very much reinforced by the Great Awakening and continued in America through the 19th and 20th century. You could really say in a lot of ways Billy Graham was an expression of this kind of expectation. How will God work in America? Well, he'll often work through a powerful preacher that will gather the attention of the whole country. And the anticipation is it may be that God will use him to completely revive the country. Now, by the time of Billy Graham, there wasn't so much post-millennial expectation anymore. But there was still a notion that God works through revivals and through special events and special preachers and special moments. And that was all very much modeled for American Christians by the Great Awakening. And it enabled many Puritans to think, our basic outlook is right. We don't face any fundamental changes taking place in society because Christ is going to build his church and glorify his church in history, and we're at the center of that. So they didn't see that, in point of fact, imperial Christianity in America was coming to an end. It was coming to an end, and the Great Awakening in some ways marked the transition. Many of the people living at the time didn't see that. Jonathan Edwards still lived in a world where the Congregational Church in New England was established. It was still the legal church. It was still the government-supported church. That would continue into the 19th century. We as Americans usually forget that. Because the Constitution says the Congress shall make no laws establishing religion. And that was to stop the Congress from interfering with Episcopalians in Virginia and Congregationalists in Massachusetts. Establishment in states continued sometimes for a decade or two into the 19th century. It eventually all ended, but the Constitution didn't end it. The states themselves made those decisions. So still in the 18th century, many Puritans could believe nothing fundamental was changing. But great changes were taking place. And the greatest change that the Great Awakening marked was a shift from religion being dominated in America by the clergy to religion being dominated in America by the laity. And again, that wasn't a shift that was broadly observed immediately. It was not immediately recognized, although some of the Puritan critics of the Great Awakening, there were some Puritans in New England who didn't like the Awakening. They thought it was too emotional. They thought it wasn't rational enough. It was dangerous in its explosive emotional dimensions. And part of what they were concerned about, they said, it's going to undermine the old standing order of the influence of ministers. And turns out, although on a lot of religious matters they weren't right, these critics, they were right about that. Up until the Great Awakening in America, and of course this didn't all shift overnight, but up until the Great Awakening in America, if you were a lay person, you would be inclined to say, when religious questions came up, well, the ministers will know that. The ministers will lead us in what we ought to believe, what we ought to do, how we ought to practice religion. There was a confidence in the ministry. There was a hesitancy to criticize the ministers. And you know, this continued perhaps longer in the Dutch Reformed churches in my background than was true in Presbyterian churches, which were more Americanized early. But many Dutch Reformed people would go to church and say, well, the minister must know about that. I'm not supposed to criticize the minister. I remember back in the 70s, still a preacher in a Dutch Reformed church would sometimes hear, I really like that sermon. I know I shouldn't say that. And sometimes guest preachers would say, why shouldn't you say that? Well, if I can tell you it's a good sermon this week, I could tell you it's a bad sermon next week, and that's not my place. Now, you see, that's not an American attitude at all, is it? Nothing is more likely than a layperson can look a minister in the eye and say, that's a bad sermon. What's the matter with you? That shift of attitude really can be traced very much to the Great Awakening. And it can almost be traced to one single document, the danger of an unconverted ministry, which said to lay people, you have to figure out if your minister is converted or not. There are ministers out there who are not converted. They're like caterpillars. They go around looking for every green thing to devour it. Wherever there's life, they're opposed to it. Well, you see that the dramatic shift. Before the Great Awakening, most American Christians were very content to go to their neighboring church. Think what church you'd go to if you went to the church nearest to where you live. You might be alarmed at the thought. But after the Great Awakening, lay people were told they had the responsibility to figure out where should they go to church. Well, if some of the ministers are unconverted, you can't just go to your minister and ask where to go to church. You have a whole new responsibility placed on you. A responsibility that's an individual responsibility. Suddenly religion becomes much more individual in its focus, and a responsibility that is focused on the laity in a way that had never been true before. And this is a shift taking place that is very much in harmony with the spirit of the age generally and the coming of the American Revolution. The American Constitution does end imperial Christianity in America. And it reflects a growing reliance upon individuals who will vote. Now, it's not radically modern, because not everybody in America could vote, according to the Constitution. Women couldn't vote, children couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote. Only men of a certain age could vote, who were not slaves. And so it isn't a completely radical democratization and individualization of American life, but it's a huge shift. It's a huge shift away from the world in which Europeans lived. Now, I raised the question, why does Calvinism seem to lose so much of its influence? If 90% of Americans were in some broad sense Calvinistic at the time of the Revolution, 1776, what happened? You may have noticed 90% of Americans today are not Calvinists. I don't want to shock you or disillusion you, but it's true. It's only maybe 85? Well, no. What happened? Well, part of what happened is that after the excitement of the Great Awakening in the 1740s, the attention of lots of Americans or colonists then, was drawn away from religion to politics. In the decades after the 1740s, more and more political issues were being raised leading up to the American Revolution. So Americans were distracted, we could say. And in fact, churches were weakened. Church attendance was weakened in America because so much energy and time and consideration was being given to the matter of the Revolution. After the Revolution, it was a new world. Not a radically new world, but a new world. A world now that didn't look primarily to England for life, for direction, for news, for what was important, but now a new country had been formed. A new sense of connection had taken place. The Great Awakening contributed to that, because when the Great Awakening was taking place, people in Massachusetts asked, what's going on in Virginia religiously? What's going on in the Carolinas religiously? And the Virginians said, what's going on in New York? Is somebody actually believing in New York? That was questionable. But up in Massachusetts and New England, there was a great stirring. And so suddenly people were not just looking back to England for news, they were looking north and south for news in the colonies. It helped create a sense of connection and identity. Before that, you were first of all a Virginian and then an Englishman. Or you were first of all a Massachusettsite, whatever they are, and an Englishman. But now suddenly you're an American. You're part of a colonial connection. And that led the way to revolution. It led the way to a new world. And it led the way to a sense of a whole new experiment. A whole new experiment. And while imperial Christianity had come to an end in the country as a whole, the country as a whole remained decidedly Christian in its culture, in its orientation, in its thought. And what happens in America is significantly different from what happened in Europe at the same period, late 18th century on into the 19th century. In Europe, in many places, the church remained established. It maintained its wealth. It maintained its institutional life. It maintained the very visible presence of its buildings. It maintained a clergy that was educated and well supported by the state. But it was an institution cut off from the people in many ways. Increasingly in Europe, Christianity wasn't really popular. It wasn't grounded in the convictions and the life and the belief of the people. In America, it became clear by the end of the 18th century that the church needed to be connected to the people, and the church did become connected to the people because of this shift from the Great Awakening towards lay people feeling they needed to be involved, to make decisions, to be active in directing the whole life of the church. Many churches in Europe, and we could see the result of that today even more clearly, many churches in Europe could continue to flourish in the sense of having buildings and clergy with nobody attending, because all the bills were paid by the state. In America, the state wasn't going to pay many church bills. If you're going to survive, you had to have people coming to make voluntary contributions to support the life of the church. This is the new world. This is the new world of post-imperial Christianity in America. And we want to, next time, start to look at what that new world is really like and how it influences the Reformed in America. Thank you.
All right, so I'd like to review some of the things from the video itself first. So what was the religious system of belief that was so strongly influencing some of our founding fathers? As I'm reading that, I'm recognizing that's kind of a poor question, generally speaking, but in light of the video that we watched, what was the system of belief that he was specifically talking about? So no, a lot of them were started off Calvinist, but then... That's why I said the bad question. Yes, deism was the one he primarily talked about there. So they weren't greatly... they're holding to deism, but they weren't overly concerned about it. Why? Deism was influencing some of them. It was causing problems, but why were some of them not really concerned about that set of beliefs? No, go ahead.
I thought it was because maybe they're post-millennial.
Right, that's why I was pointing to Nick, because that's what Nick said earlier. Post-millennial, because they were held to this post-millennial view. Now, let's take a step back. Let's define our terms. So what do we mean when we say deism?
God created the world and then left it to its own devices.
All right, so God wound up the clock and set it, and that's it. That's all there is to it. He doesn't interfere in the everyday workings of our world today is the idea behind deism. That there is a God, he's there, he created the world, but he doesn't interfere in our day-to-day lives. He kind of leaves us to our own devices. So what is post-millennial then?
The church will constantly get better.
Okay, and that's what he said, that the church is going, that things are going to get better and better. And I want to be careful with that because it's a little bit of a mischaracterization. I know some very good Christians who are post-millennials. I don't agree with them, but the father of post-millennialism would have been probably Herbert. He's an Englishman who said that religion should be based on thinking and on reason, things that we can understand together, and not on revelation. And so we believe that there's a God, that there's sin, but it's up to us as man to recognize that problem and such. So God doesn't interfere with it. Voltaire was another who was a huge deist. In America, Thomas Paine was a very, very well-known deist. But anyway, so deism, God set the world on its path and let it be. Postmillennial, that specifically the Christian world is going to get better and better, is the idea that God's kingdom will advance, not just a general well-being in the world. All right, so with that in mind, let's move forward. So the Puritans weren't greatly concerned about deism because of the postmillennialism. They think that this is going to override those concerns. And that sort of confidence made beliefs, such as deism, something that the church wasn't really concerned about. And that's what I just answered. So how did the Great Awakening fit into that Puritan mindset?
Approved it for them.
Okay, it kind of approved it for them, right? The church is getting better because look at all these people coming to Christ. Which he mentioned Whitefield there, well-known pastor from England. He actually trained in theater, and that was one of the reasons why so many people wanted to come and see him. He was very dramatic on stage. In his preaching, he was very dramatic. He used lots of illustrations. He used vocal techniques. Ben Franklin and him were very close friends, which, by the way, Ben Franklin was a deist. He believed God wound up the world and that we are responsible for the rest of the things. But Ben Franklin, also being a scientist, really kind of took and scouted out a lot of things as it relates to George Whitefield, especially being trained in theater. He was able to reach huge crowds, and I think one of the crowds he marked off and said 23,000 people could have heard Whitefield without amplification. He had a good understanding, not just of, he was a big barrel-chested man, had lots of resonance there, but also had understanding of how to use the surrounding area to the best effect and would position himself so that way the most people could hear him as well. So, again, deism may have indicated that the church was weakening in its influence, and the Great Awakening really reinforced that post-millennial expectation. So Jonathan Edwards would have been the other well-known individual from the Great Awakening, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which, interestingly enough, he preached that exact sermon in his hometown where he was pastor and got no response whatsoever. And when he preaches it, I don't remember the town it was actually in, but when he preaches it in the other town, he actually wasn't supposed to speak. The pastor for the day was sick, or the circuit rider didn't show up. I don't remember which it was. And he and some friends were coming through town and were going to worship with them. And he said, well, I got my sermon, in my saddlebag. If you want, I can read it. And they said, please, we'd have nothing else. And so he went and pulled it out and read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God there. And God used it to convert the masses at that point. Anyway, so the Great Awakening just confirmed that future success of the church because it really shook the fabric of religion. And so the intellectual and cultural life in the colonies really shifted at that point. And what did it shift from? Well, I think we're going to get into that. So what was the greatest change brought about by the Great Awakening?
More involvement by the laity.
Okay, more involvement by the people, not the leadership of the church. Why do you think that was? Why does that happen here in the Great Awakening? What can you think about in history that may have affected that?
The revolution?
Okay,
I don't know.
so Aaron, you look like you were getting ready to say something.
Well, weren't tensions with Europe in particular, the crown kind of starting to really bear down oppressively upon the Americans was started already by the 1740s.
Okay,
There was
yep.
already tensions with people against England from England starting to say like, oh, we think we actually want to rule the Americans, not just kick them out and let them colonize over there. Because they realized that America was a valuable land.
Right. So that certainly plays into it. The other thing that plays into it is the background that they're coming from. Is you have some that are coming from the Scotch-Irish who have had a heavy fight with the Anglican Church, who has had a heavy fight with the Roman Catholic Church. What do all of these things have in common? Who is in, yeah?
The focus on individualism.
Okay, so we're coming to the focus on individualism here, but they're coming from a point of view that says the church is in charge of everything. They're in charge of the government, they're in charge of your everyday life, and so when it comes to the Great Awakening, there's this huge shift going from, hang on a second, I thought we just left these people partly because of some of these problems, and so now this adds into that gradual transition from the church telling you what to think and when to think it and where to go and what to do, to the individuals going, well, I could decide that for myself. And you can argue on both sides whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but that's what's happening here. And so there's this religious life shift from being dominated by the clergy to being dominated by the common people, the laity, and individuals begin to feel burdened about their own beliefs, about their own practices, what they do, and they're not just going, well, that's what the pastor said, so that's what we have to do, which is sort of what happened there with the Reformation, right? It says, wait a second, I can now read the Bible for myself and see that what they're saying isn't what the Bible is saying. And so it's along those same veins. So how did this change also manifest itself in the American political life?
Removal of government control and state control and involvement in the church.
Right. And so the state now, they say, we don't want the state to be the ones who dictate what church we have to have or how we have to have it and what day of the week and where we're allowed to meet and all this. We want to let the church decide. We also, as the individuals, want to decide. And so I don't want to necessarily just go to the church down the street because it's the closest one, right? Maybe I don't agree with what they're teaching there, or maybe what they're teaching is wrong. And so individuals take on this greater spiritual responsibility. And with that, we have the founding of America, which is the new reliance on individuals, specifically as it comes to voting rights. So we've talked about deism, we've talked about postmillennialism. How are they opposed to each other?
Postmillennial says that God is going to improve the church life and improve the revivals and the awakenings, that God is still in control, where deism says he's not. He's
Yeah.
just watching.
Exactly. So post-mill says God is actively involved in our lives. Deism says it's not. So how did the Puritans see the Great Awakening in a positive light? How did they see it as a good thing?
Postmillennialism.
Okay, yeah, the church is advancing. How did they see it in a negative light?
They thought it was too emotional and then off track.
Yeah, and they said, okay, we're getting away from the facts here and just how do I feel, right? And this is where, I don't know if you mentioned Gilbert Tennant there near the end. Gilbert Tennant's another individual who starts off Presbyterian, but really, he's kind of the father of the altar call. He gets a very emotional appeal to the people to get them, walk this aisle and you should feel the moving of the Spirit in your life. And if you don't have that feeling down deep inside, then maybe you need to do it again. So in what way was the shift of the Great Awakening essential to the life of the church in America? So how is it different than the church in Europe?
Church in Europe was very top-heavy, top-down, whereas in here, this actually brought life into the church because people were taking charge. Basically.
Absolutely. Who's the head of the church? Who's the head of the Church of England?
King.
The king or the queen, right? At this time, the king. And so that's the issue here. The Americans receive they don't receive state support from the church. It's on the individuals. It's on the pastors. And so in England, you have people. I know we're going back a little bit farther, but like John Bunyan, he's thrown in prison because you had to have a license to preach. Now you could preach if you were farther than 5 miles outside of town without a license, but there's nobody 5 miles outside of town, so how are you going to preach? That's part of the issue. And so he didn't have a license to preach. He didn't have approval from the church to preach, which, by the way, the state, or I say from the church, it's from the state that he had to have approval. And the state, by the way, is the one who paid their salary. And so if you don't have that license to preach, you're not getting paid by the government. And if you're getting paid by the government, guess who approves what you're allowed to say? The government. And so if you talk badly against the king, guess what happens? Your license is revoked, along with who knows what other issues may have followed. Imprisonment, as we see with John Bunyan. Your life as well may have been permanently revoked. So in Europe, the churches there survived because they could maintain their buildings and their properties, even if the people weren't attending the church, because it's propped up by the state. But churches in America are very dependent on voluntary members contributing their individual income to survive. And so there's a deeper sense of the individual's responsibility, because without the individuals, there is no church to exist there. And so the individual's responsibility in the church is really a product of that great awakening. All right, quiz time. So we have our questions here. And so which of these groups was not a part of the Calvinistic influence on top of the 90% of the American colonist population? The Dutch Reformed, Anglicans, Puritans, or Methodists? Okay, Methodists. Where do Methodists come from? John and Charles Wesley, who had initially come to, I think, Georgia to be missionaries, and while they're there, they're not Christians. They're there, and they know about the Bible, but said it wasn't real for them. They go back home, and it's interesting. I think it's within a week of each other. John's reading Martin Luther's commentary to the Romans, and Charles is reading Martin Luther's commentary to the Galatians, and both of them came to the same conclusion within a week of each other. Wait, Christ died for me. And anyway, so that's where we get the Methodists from. And actually, the Methodists were not supposed to be a different denomination. That was John and Charles' idea of a method of reviving the Anglican Church, which didn't revive enough for them, and so they ended up splitting off eventually, or their followers eventually did. So all these groups had influences in the colonial Americas, but the Methodists were not Calvinistic.
That's where the AME churches come from in the South.
Yep, the African AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Godfrey especially noted how the Puritans and the Dutch Reformed and the Anglicans were those ones who established those Reformed influences here in America. And then even the German population in America can be included in that sphere of influence with the Moravians, Duke Zinzendorf. All right, and then we have the Savoy Declaration of 1658. And what happens? Oh man, that's the answer.
Thank you.
So the Reformed Confession was the Savoy Declaration that they affirm postmillennialism. And so the Savoy Declaration comes about 10 years after the Westminster Confession of Faith. So we have the Westminster Confession, and then they take that and adapt it in the late 1650s and brought by the Puritans there. And that was one of the major changes to the language of the Westminster Confession. All right, number 3. What are the 2 most famous names associated with the Great Awakening? All right, B there. Edwards and Whitefield. Both of these men were preachers and evangelists and missionaries who really advanced the Great Awakening here in America. Probably the more influential of the two would have been Whitefield, although arguably they both had a significant impact. All right, number 4. Which of the following led the laity to examine the spiritual life of ministers? The ministry of the lost, or the misery of the lost, sinners in the hands of an angry God, the danger of an unconverted ministry, or the good shepherd? Okay, so the danger of the unconverted ministry, which, by the way, that was written by Gilbert Tennant, the man I mentioned earlier, who's really the father of the altar call and emotionalism. All right, so the most famous sermon preached during the Great Awakening is certainly Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and again, drew thousands of people there for Whitefield. But Tennant, Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry, is what really marks the shift in the Great Awakening. And what was the change that the Great Awakening brought on? It was 2 kind of major ones we talked about.
Was it the shift from the domination of the church from the clergyman to the laity?
Okay, that was one of them. And what's the second? That's what Phoebe said, kind of the shift to the individuals, yeah.
The shift away from government control.
No, from religion to political.
From religion to political, and with that, the emotionalism that comes with it, right? That emotional feel, and again, that really goes back to Tennant. And Tennant really came in, and part of his emotional appeal was to call the pastors on the carpet and say, do you know that you're saved? How do you know? Or do you have this feeling, right? All right, number 5. True or false? English Puritans expressed great consternation over the growing influence of deism.
False.
False. And why was that again?
Because it was going in the direction he thought that.
Yep, because they post-millennial, and we see the world working. It doesn't matter that you think that God's not working. We can clearly see He is. Look at the Great Awakening, right? And then number 6. What was the term awakening meant to convey? Mass conversion of unbelievers, mass conversion of nominal Christians, new identification with national religion, or new interest in religious matters? D. Right, the new interest in religious matters. So the period of the Great Awakening could have resulted in large number of conversions of unbelievers and nominal Christians, but the awakening term was what was actually used by the Puritans to describe that new interest in religious matters. And again, that fits perfectly in line with their postmillennial view. Any questions or comments? All right, we'll go ahead and close this time in prayer then. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you even for the roots that we've seen of the Reformed Christians here in America, Lord. We pray that you would help us to understand the truth of your work in our lives and how you are at work in the world today. The church has never needed Caesar's favor to be prosperous, Father, but we need nothing more and nothing less than your gospel. Help us to focus on that. In Christ's name, amen.